Moccasin Trail, Chapter 16. Yep, hoss, Tom said, leaning back on his elbow and stretching out a foot to shove a log further into the fire. I kind of figured all along it was this valley the letter was talking about, so Johnny warn't no spirit after all. Jim grinned, not by a long chalk. He's mighty lively. When am I going to get to see him? Tomorrow. We'll go on down there tomorrow. Tonight, though, there was still too much unsaid. They'd barely started. After the first joyous confusion of back-thumping, hand-shaking, and incoherent questions and answers, their soul thought it had been to get away from the town. Their sole thought had been to get away from the town and the staring onlookers. Off alone where they could talk. But conversation during the ride west into the hills had been curtailed by the reckless pace they set each other, and limited to cheerful insults and discussions of campsites. Even later, making camp and seeing to the horses, they had exchanged only scraps of information about themselves. Jim parrying Tom's frequent questions for no reason he could think of except that there was such a vast amount to tell and he didn't know where to start. They were lounging now beside the supper fire near the banks of the little stream, chewing the last of the buffalo jerky Tom had produced from his possibles. It was good beyond all belief to eat buffalo again, to sprawl like this, watching the firelight dance over Tom's familiar, weather-beaten face. He looked thinner than Jim remembered him, but his blue eyes were shrewd as ever, his drawl as soft and his grin as warm. He'd run into Blackjaw Hervey down at Taos, and heard about the boy in the wagon train who looked like Adam Russell, and he had told Hervey the letter reached its mark. We figured you two must have got together at the Dallas, and from there, they ain't no place much to go except in west. That how it happened? Yeah, that's it, Tom. How was Taos? Wah, mighty slow. Warn't but half a dozen trappers in the whole town, and more Mexicans than Injuns. Why, you hardly couldn't get you up a hand game. Warn't Pally out there? Or Evart? Tom shook his head. Gone back to the States. Everybody's gone. Scattered. Dead. Quit the trade. Hervey was heading east when I left for California. How come you went to California? Shucks, I don't know. It was the only place I hadn't been. It's quite a place, if you savvy Spanish. Mighty nice weather. And trees. Hoss, you ain't ever rightly seen a tree till you met up with one of them redwoods. They're a mile around. His smile faded. Rest of the place is kind of bare, though. Down south in Mission Country it is. And it don't ever get winter there, he shrugged. I don't know. It ain't for me. Any beaver? Nah. There was an unexpected bitterness in the syllable. Tom fished in his pouch a moment and drew out his pipe. In the silence, Jim could hear the stream running along out there in the dark, and the night wind high in the branches, and the soft ripping noise the horses made as they cropped the grass. It sounded lonesome. Tom, I thought you was going to go get your squaw. I did get her. Rivers smiled crookedly, his long fingers snuffing kinnick into his pipe. That familiar, long-stemmed Indian pipe made of red clay known only to the Plains tribes. The bowl marked in black and white and a Blackfoot symbol. I did get her, but I reckon she figured there weren't much future in a beaver man no more. Long about a month ago, when we weren't too fur from Nez Perce country, she up and packed her parfletch and roped her hoss and tuck off home back to them relatives. Tom smiled again. I couldn't blame her. It was Tom who was lonesome, mighty lonesome. You aim to stay in here? Jim asked gently. You'd be welcome. Oh, I'll hang around a while, but, hoss, I doubt if I'll ever get to feeling natural in a valley. You could try it out. You gotta do something. Tom pulled a blazing twig out of the fire and held it to his pipe before he answered. Then he said very casually, I hear they's still beaver in the Rockies, South Park. Jim watched him closely as the little flame dimmed and flared, dimmed and flared over the glowing tobacco. Was Tom feeling him out? Before he could decide, Rivers tossed away the twig, lay back on his elbow, his grin veiled by a cloud of thin smoke. Look here, Hoss. I come up here just mainly to find out how you was making out. Ain't you going to tell me? By golly, the next time I'm fool enough to hike over a mountain range to hunt up some no-good knife-throwing, yaller-eyed coyote what won't even open his trap. He dodged amiably as Jim's knife came sailing past his ear. Ain't slowed down none, I see. Well, I ain't either. He reached up without looking and yanked the knife out of the tree behind his head. Go on. That won't change my mind none. Start talking. Jim grinned and settled himself comfortably. What'd you want to hear? Want to hear all about this plowing you've been doing, Jim Keith, a farmer. By golly, that takes some believin'. Jim's grin vanished. I ain't no farmer. Why, you said you got 20 acres of wheat getting along for harvest. Johnny's wheat. For all I care, it could be sagebrush. Rivers leaned forward. What's the matter, Hoss? He asked softly. Ain't that medicine of yourn workin'? It ain't the medicine's fault. It ain't Johnny neither. And by gor, it ain't mine. Jim shifted irritably, picked up a leaf, and began tearing it to pieces. Farmin' just ain't in me, Tom. I done the best I could for 4-5 months now, livin' in the cabin, workin' from sunup to evenin', holdin' in when I wanted to bust loose, and by thunder, I been wantin' to bust. Every time I look up and see the mountains yonder, with the snows gone and the way open, clean through. He flung the leaf away and got up, wandering restlessly about the fire where Moki's yellow eyes watched every move. Tom lay very still, puffing quietly. Presently he murmured, 4 or 5 months. What about afore that? Well, I reckon I weren't even trying afore that. Didn't know how. I kept doing things Injun like I was used to. My sister, she sure don't like Injuns. You got a sister too? Jim smiled, thinking of the shining hair and fierce little chin and flying skirts. Yeah, Sally. She's only 15. Prettiest little thing you ever saw. So you're the oldest? Why, hallelujah, Jim. You mean them 3 young'uns come all the way from Missouri alone? Not all the way. Jim came back and sat down. Not all the way. My mother was with them when they started. Tom, if only we'd been on that Sweetwater sooner instead of on the Powder, I could have seen her before she died. He began to tell it all. Then, at first slowly with the pauses to gather his thoughts, then more rapidly, reliving the whole thing as he described the snowy passes above the gorge, Dan'l's mutiny and his own tearing hunger, the journey's end by the still waters of the Tualatin. It was hard to explain the first taste of hoe cake and how he felt about the clock, but he made a stab at it, and the lonely, defiant weeks he'd spent in the teepee, the games with Dan'l, the beautiful rejected mare. He didn't skip anything. Most of all, he talked about Sally and his brothers, trying to make Tom feel what he had felt, know them as he did, especially Johnny. My brother, he's a wonder, Tom. He knows how the stick's floatin'. When I get to feelin' itchy-footed and no account, he'll say, Jim, you take off huntin' today. I don't need you. Blast it, now get goin'. He's figured out how it is with me, though he don't ever feel that way hisself. Ain't that something now? Yeah, said Rivers softly, it's something. The pipe lay forgotten in his cupped hand, and his expression was hard to fathom. Jim sat up and rumpled Moki's ears. It don't get no easier, all the same, stayin' put. I reckon it ain't never goin' to, for an Injun like me. You ain't no Injun, Hoss, not any more. Maybe not, Jim burst out, but I ain't no farmer neither, Tom. He paused, searching the older man's eyes with sudden hunger. You said you heard they was still beaver back in South Park? Rivers' face changed. He spoke in a different tone, low and flat and tired. Hoss, there likely ain't a word of truth in it. Stick to your cabin. That medicine of urine was often powerful, a lot stronger than I give it credit for. Puzzled and somehow uneasy, Jim studied the familiar, rugged profile. darkly outlined against the flames, but quite unreadable. What did Tom mean? That he'd rather trap alone? Then why'd he come 1,000 miles out of his way to hunt up an old companion? He shrugged. The matter was out of his mind and lay down to sleep. He was still awake long after the fire had burned to crimson embers, and the familiar hump shape next to him lay deep in sleep. There was something changed about his friend since they'd parted nearly a year ago by the banks of the Powder, but try as he would, he couldn't put his finger on what it was. It continued to plague and delude him over the next month and a half. Tom hung around until September was all but gone. For Jim, it was a strange period in which now familiar life in the valley, his family, the neighbors, his work around the claim, all took on a curious unreality, as if he knew them in a dream. His mind was absorbed with Tom, and his days, like an iceberg, were lived 4/5 below the surface, in a dark region where cross currents of thought and feeling, none of which he understood, tugged and strained deep inside himself. Only one of the young Keiths failed to welcome Jim's friend wholeheartedly. The first morning they met, Johnny and Tom had sized each other up and shaken hands on it, each thoroughly approving. Sally, too, was taken with Rivers' slow grin and easy drawl. Before he had been camped 2 days under the big oak where the teepee used to stand, she was treating him like an old friend of the family. She alternately pampered and bullied him, stuffing him with hoe cake and venison, scolding him for his thin ribs in a way that captivated him entirely. Dan'l alone was unresponsive. Tom tried his best to make friends with the boy, hauling out his gaudiest yarns of scalpings and escapes, presenting him with a knife that had once belonged to a pigeon chief. Dan'l accepted both tales and gift, torn between interest and hostility, but he remained aloof. "Looks like I lost my touch," Rivers remarked to Jim one day, not altogether humorously, as they watched the boy's uncompromising young back recede in the direction of the glades. First thing you know, Mokey'll be growling at me, and when dogs and young'uns turn against a man, ain't much use wasting the gunpowder to blow him into hallelujah. Wah, you ain't that ornery yet. The boy's got some fool notion in his head, that's all. It's sartin he don't care much for the smell of my bait. Him and that squaw of mine." Rivers' grin twisted, as it so often did these days. Maybe they're both right. Jim scoffed at him cheerfully, but the boy's attitude puzzled him, and he mentioned it to Jonathan, who had an answer for him immediately. "Why, blast it, Jim, you going blind? He's jealous, that's all. Scared Tom's going to steal you away and take you back to trapping." Johnny hesitated. "You could set his mind at rest." "I tried to, but it's been a long spell since I carried any weight with Dan'l. He don't believe me." "Wah, he'll get over it," muttered Jim vaguely. His gaze had wandered out over the fields and treetops to the haze-blued cone of Mount Hood, and he was no longer thinking about Dan'l. Harvest time came and went without really breaking through his preoccupation. He took turns with Johnny at wielding the great scythe, tied endless shocks of wheat, and swung the flail without giving much attention to any of it, except the surprising fact that Tom should be there too, working good-naturedly by his side. He did realize dimly, as he stood at last beside his brother, surveying the bulging sacks of grain, that it mattered to him after all, that this was wheat and not sagebrush. He did not stop to examine the discovery, merely noting that Johnny's grin was good to see, and feeling somewhat repaid for all those weeks of tearing out stumps and scattering seed. Then he went to find Tom. With harvest done, there was nothing to prevent their roaming as they liked, searching the hills for game and the streams for beaver, racing Buckskin and Tucky hard and fast over the hills, pretending there was nothing on their minds but the next meal. They went to see Joe Meek. He was home this time, home and bursting to talk. The bellow of delight he let out when he glimpsed Tom was worth half a year's catch. As Tom said afterwards, and the spate of food and drink and trappers' talk and roaring merriment that filled the afternoon and night was as good as a regular old-time rendezvous. And now again, almost against his will, Jim found himself watching Tom curiously, puzzling over what it was about him that had changed. One evening at the Rutledges, when all the neighbors round about had gathered to pool their suppers and celebrate the bountiful harvest, he almost put his finger on it, though not quite. It was a merry evening, redolent with the smells of venison and wood smoke, noisy with laughter and the shouts of children, the hubbub twined and woven through with the twinkling notes of Johnny's banjo. And after the feast, a group of men gathered, as they always did, to prop their worn boots on fence rail or wagon tongue, and smoke and talk. Rutledge was among them, and Mills and Burke and Sam Mullins and Johnny and Ab Selway and Jim and Tom. He stood leaning against the wagon wheel, puffing his long red pipe, lithe and lean in a way no bourgeois ever achieved, his weather-beaten features half hidden by the veil of smoke. He seemed removed from the others, drawn apart, though he stood in their midst. 30 bushels to the acre, Mills was saying with satisfaction. You wait. The folks back east ain't gonna stay there long with that kind of haul coming in out here. I bet they's wagons crossing the Blues this minute, rolling down them rocky stretches to the Dalles, coming through the gorge. Man, I'm glad it ain't me, somebody muttered. They was wagons down to Oregon City yesterday, Ab Selway offered. Folks from away back yonder, Pennsylvania and Connecticut, said they was hundreds of folks piled up at the Dalles, waiting on boats to take 'em through. And the boats are scarce, and the prices terrible. Regular robbery it's turned into. Why'n't they build themselves rafts like we done? Why, shucks, the place is stripped of timber by this time. Feller in the fuss wagon, he told me they was talk of finding an overland route, taking wagons right over them mountains. There was an outburst of disbelief. Why, criminy, ain't no way through them mountains, everybody knows that. You mean they's folks trying it? They's some feller trying to take a bunch through, name of Barlow. Whole crew of 'em will be lost, of course. Maybe not, put in Rutledge's deep voice suddenly. As always, when Rutledge spoke, the others fell quiet. They all respected the huge, well-spoken, thoughtful man. If they ain't no other way to get here, he went on, I reckon they'll make it. But Lord Almighty, Mr. Rutledge, said Johnny, they say them slopes is straight up and down, and with the snow and all, seems impossible. Remember Windlass Hill, Johnny? We all come down that, and by Jiminy, that seemed impossible. Wasn't no pleasure, jaunt, fording the Snake, this side of Fort Hall, neither. Rutledge turned thoughtfully to Tom. What's your idea on it? Rivers, think they's a way through them Cascades? For a mountain goat they is, Rivers drawled, scratching his cheek with the end of his long pipe stem. For men on hosses they is. Jim and me done it once, but then we cut our teeth on high country. I wouldn't say no bourgeois with a wagon could make it. The faces around them changed a bit. Jim could see the stubborn pride come awaken everyone. Up till a couple year ago, folks said no wagon could get past Fort Hall, Mills reminded, or across them deserts, or through the gorge. Rivers smiled and nodded. Yeah, I know, but you ain't seen a certain hill just south of Mount Hood. Ain't nothing grow on it but a few old laurels. Too steep. Ain't no wagon ever gonna make that, and there's no way around it. The men heard him in silence, unable to contradict since they hadn't been there. But when the talk rose up again, it was brisk and undismayed, about the new settlement called Portland, across from Vancouver, where the Willamette joined the Columbia, about this year's crops and the next year's plans, about the burgeoning new government and the possibility of statehood in the foreseeable future. Rutledge talked quietly to Tom, asking questions and nodding courteously at the answers. But Jim wondered what was in the big man's mind, for his face was thoughtful as he studied Rivers. He knew what was in Tom's mind. It was all there to read. Tom was far away, riding along over some remembered wilderness. At that moment, Jim came near to glimpsing what it was that troubled him and his friend. But Tom turned suddenly to laugh at something Rutledge said, and the impression vanished. Jim knew only that Tom Rivers was the loneliest man he'd ever seen, and his knowledge grew until the hubbub around him faded, and the gay crowds vanished, and there was nothing left in his mind but Tom, and the old good days, and his own fierce and overwhelming loyalty. 3 days later, when Tom Rivers rode quietly out the clearing in the murky gray of dawn, Jim rode with him. His belongings were loaded in the old way on Bad Medicine's back. Moki raced alongside, and Buckskin's nose was pointed towards the high Cascades.